I was in the Marine Corps. I deployed to Iraq in 2003. When I got back, I was managing a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms. The disassociation, the flashbacks. There were some points where I would actually forget where I was, what I was doing. It was really scary.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a very debilitating condition. It occurs after someone experiences a life-threatening event or witnesses a life-threatening event or a repeated series of these events. And it can leave someone in a state of chronic emotional dysregulation, and it really can negatively impact quality of life. We need a completely new way to approach it. And with MDMA-assisted therapy, it's been really exciting to see it enter the FDA approval process. And I think it's a completely compelling new form of treating trauma.
There are no medications that are proven effective for PTSD. There's been some progress made in the last 30 years with diagnosis and treatment, but we have plenty of room for improvement still. I believe that anything could work, but until you prove it, as a scientific physician, I can't accept it.
For years, post-traumatic stress disorder was misunderstood, misdiagnosed, poorly treated, or even ignored. Today, science has given us a much clearer picture of how trauma affects the brain and the body. Still, the treatment options haven't quite kept up, especially when it comes to severe PTSD in people like combat veterans, first responders, and survivors of sexual violence. Now, an unlikely contender is making waves: MDMA. More commonly referred to as ecstasy or Molly, MDMA is usually considered a party drug, but a growing body of research claims that MDMA can lead to breakthroughs for PTSD by incorporating it into therapeutic sessions with trauma victims. Currently, MDMA is classified by the Drug Enforcement Administration as a Schedule I drug, which means they consider it to have high potential for abuse and no medical use. This, plus the fact that the Food and Drug Administration has so far declined to rule MDMA safe and effective, means that MDMA cannot be legally prescribed, and it is difficult, even illegal, to research it. Is it time to reassess MDMA's potential role in medical treatment? And more importantly, should citizens have the right to access treatments they think could improve their health or the well-being of their families? Welcome to Shaped, where we'll explore the nexus of regulation, innovation, and the impact it has on people like you. Prior to the 20th century, the United States operated without centralized food and drug regulation. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, enacted under President Theodore Roosevelt, established the Bureau of Chemistry, a predecessor to the FDA, to address concerns over adulterated products and deceptive labeling. This legislation marked the onset of federal oversight, fundamentally reshaping the landscape of pharmaceutical and food and safety regulation.
The Pure Food and Drug Act required truth in labeling, but it didn't focus on safety. Years later, there was the sulfanilamide tragedy in which an antibiotic was tainted with antifreeze, and that killed over 100 people. So that led to the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that was really the first iteration of the FDA, and it required scientific studies to prove safety before a drug could be approved. Then years later, there was the thalidomide scandal, and that was a drug that was given to pregnant women that caused severe birth defects in thousands of babies. And because of that, in 1962, we had what's called the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the FDA Act, and that required safety and efficacy trials before a drug could be approved. And with those amendments, that really birthed the clinical phase trial system that we have today.
The FDA now evaluates new drugs through a rigorous, multi-stage process called the phase system to ensure that they are both safe and effective before reaching the public. It begins with preclinical lab and animal testing, followed by 4 phases of human trials. Phase 1 tests safety and dosage in small groups. Phase 2 evaluates effectiveness and safety in larger groups. Phase 3 confirms effectiveness and compares the drug to existing treatments in large populations. And Phase 4 monitors long-term effects after approval. On average, the FDA drug approval process takes roughly 10 years, with the clinical trial phases accounting for 6 to 7 years of that time.
Safety begins in the laboratory. Before a drug ever gets anywhere near a human being, companies know what the rules are, and they drop the drug when it breaks the rules. But there's a lot of drugs that came on the market before the 1960s, like amphetamines, for instance. There's no way they would get approved in the research market today because they kill neurons in the brain. Plus, they cause cardiac arrhythmias. And hallucinogens have been around since the 30s, 40s, and 50s as well. And people want to repurpose them as drugs, but they've never been tested in mice and rats. We don't know if they cause cancer or not. We don't know if they cause seizures. So the FDA is very important to have a basic research basis to medical practice.
Psychedelics, often called hallucinogens, are substances that alter perception, thoughts, and emotions, sometimes causing vivid sensory distortions. MDMA is often grouped in this category, but it's more accurately described as an empathogen, a compound that enhances feelings of emotional connection and openness, rather than triggering hallucinations. MDMA was first synthesized in a German laboratory in 1912 and remained relatively obscure until American researchers began exploring its therapeutic potential in the 1970s. MDMA soon gained popularity as a recreational drug, prompting concerns about abuse and neurotoxicity. In 1985, it was classified as an illegal substance, and as a result, all scientific research into its effects require approval from the Drug Enforcement Administration.
When psychedelics really came to the popular consciousness in the 60s and 70s, there was a peak of scientific exploration and cultural experimentation, and that's what we call the first psychedelic renaissance. Because of concerns about recreational abuse and misuse, eventually psychedelics became illegal, and that pretty much had a chilling effect on the research. But decades and decades later, more and more scientific evidence is showing that they truly have some medical potential. You have groups like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, which is an advocacy group to promote psychedelic research. You have prestigious universities who are also promoting psychedelic research, veterans groups, and consumer advocacy groups, and they're all playing a pivotal role in sounding the call to try to bring these medicines to the public as medical treatments.
As a result of this continued research, MDMA has reemerged as a possible therapeutic drug for PTSD. In 2017, after promising phase 2 clinical trials, the FDA gave breakthrough therapy status to MDMA-assisted therapy, a designation reserved for treatments that show real potential. This sped up research, leading to larger phase 3 trials and bringing MDMA closer to possible medical approval.
Breakthrough status doesn't mean it works. It means you say it works and everyone's interested in it, and we're quite willing to speed up the process for you. But 90% of drugs fail before they even get to humans. So less than 5 to 10% of drugs from the very beginning ever make it to the market. It's a very expensive process, but a very careful one, which ensures safety.
Both MDMA and the approval process remain controversial. With phase 1 trials beginning in 2000, MDMA's process has lasted for over 24 years to the tune of an estimated $180 million.
There's both risks and benefits, and that's something that you always have to weigh, that concern of speed versus safety. If something is approved quickly, then it can reach the public a lot sooner and really help people who are suffering from this condition, but that comes at the risk of not really understanding some of the long-term safety risks. Alternatively, if it is stuck in a very long regulatory process, a lot of people are still experiencing the challenges of this condition, and clinicians are really having a hard time trying to treat such a treatment-resistant condition for people.
Zach Skiles served as a U.S. Marine during the early 2000s and saw combat in the early stages of the Iraq War. After returning home, he faced severe PTSD, which left him homeless and struggling with mental health challenges, despite trying traditional treatments.
When I got back, I was managing a lot of symptoms of post-trauma that I wasn't fully aware were post-traumatic stress symptoms. And inevitably, my social relationships suffered and got to the point where I didn't have any place to stay. I was homeless and ended up in a private PTSD clinic called the Pathway Home at the California Veterans Home. And I just threw myself into understanding PTSD and just learning everything I could about my experience.
Zach became a licensed psychologist specializing in PTSD treatment, yet he continued to struggle with his own trauma. He says his turning point came when he participated in an experimental MDMA-assisted therapy program at the VA.
Psychedelic-assisted therapies significantly helped me reset and recover and really put some meaning to experiences I had. But that was in Mexico. Even though it was some of the most profound work I've ever seen, we couldn't talk about it because it was illegal in the United States. And so I started to organize groups of VA researchers and was able to start a small group of active clinicians who were dosing folks within the VA.
Zach's story makes a strong case for MDMA-assisted therapy, but it remains anecdotal. The FDA emphasizes that more research is needed to fully understand the drug's safety and effectiveness.
I think right now most people, when they think of psychedelics in general, they do think of the party scene. They think of it being abused and used recreationally rather than a potential for therapy. But this medicine is not for everyone. Psychedelics are a tool to get you in touch with some of that subconscious material or traumatic material. There are many other ways that we can get there too. And right now the research is showing that psychedelics can help maybe 60 to 70% of people. And we know that some people aren't responding to it at all. So there needs to be more research and more understanding built around like who is it for, how can we use it, and if it doesn't work, then what?
In August 2024, the FDA decided not to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for treating PTSD after an advisory panel raised concerns about the treatment's effectiveness, potential risks, and the ethics of how the studies were conducted.
There was one study that was 18 weeks long. It was done by an activist group that's not actually researchers, but rather psychedelic advocates. It's not a long-term study, and the benefit over placebo was overstated. You'll hear people say MDMA worked in 90% of patients in this study. Well, placebo worked in 70% of them. They don't tell you that. That's statistically meaningful, but it's not a 90% improvement, it's just a 20% improvement. Furthermore, there was some sexual misconduct in the study and data manipulation. One of the scientific journals retracted the results of the study. So, that kind of research is not acceptable.
The FDA asked for more data, including a third phase 3 clinical trial, to better assess whether MDMA-assisted therapy is truly safe and effective.
One of the problems with MDMA is when you compare it to placebo, it was easy for patients to guess that they were receiving it. And that can result in something that's called expectancy bias, where if you believe you got the treatment drug, you might, whether subconsciously or consciously, overemphasize the positive effects and downplay the adverse effects, and that can skew the research data. Even though they did some long-term follow-up, they didn't capture concerns about cardiovascular risks, neurotoxicity, and so the FDA felt that there wasn't enough data on the long-term risks. But holding up the approval for 2 years or more, that could be at the cost of patients' lives. So yes, long-term studies are extremely important, but there's mechanisms in place where you can have the drug approved and still have strict protocols where you're observing long-term outcomes after it's been approved and it's gone to market.
This decision raises important questions, not only about MDMA therapy, but how we regulate drugs more broadly in the United States. Are the current approval processes too strict, potentially delaying valuable treatments for people in need? Or is such strictness vital to protecting vulnerable people from harm?
Having heard everything of what was brought up at the committee, I completely understand why it wasn't approved, and there are markers even in my own experiences that made sense to me. Although it's disappointing, I think it's important to be really judicious, specifically with any kind of substance that's assisting a therapy.
We need ethics around psychedelics. We need supervision. We need somebody our therapists can report to and say, hey, this is what came up. This is how we're processing it. This is how we move forward with it. I was sad to see how many people won't be getting it, but also happy because I'm hearing all the things that are coming out of that meeting and the things that need to be put in place before we do this safely.
A lot of the subject matter experts are academics who are setting up psychedelic research groups, and they overstate benefits. They're not actually doing studies in as objective a way as they should. Well, that introduces a bias right away, and I think that's an issue. I'm open to any medication being effective for anything, but hallucinogens have a lot of harms and risks, so you better show me they really work before I accept the idea. So I'm not sure if large-scale reform is needed, but I think small-scale changes can be made, and those small-scale changes need to be made at the FDA, not from people outside.
Even though MDMA-assisted therapy doesn't neatly fit into the standard drug approval paradigm, we do have examples of how the FDA can work with it. There's a form of ketamine that is a psychedelic, and it is also under a REMS program, which is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. And that is a treatment that's only administered in licensed centers with licensed therapists, and it's not something that patients take home. So we can use that as an example, and the hope is that those shifts will continue moving forward, and eventually there creates a pathway for more access to patients.
We know in the brain, certainly at high doses, these drugs are neurotoxic and they kill neurons. They can cause seizures. They're also addictive, and people who use them tend to abuse other drugs too. But the real way of trying to see whether something's beneficial in medicine is not to look at the symptoms, but are you treating the underlying disease? And you don't know that unless you do a study for a year, 2 years, or longer. So these are the kinds of studies that need to be done. We call them disease-modifying studies. And they're not being done by the psychedelic advocates because it's much more expensive to do a year or 2 years, and it's much harder to show benefit.
Striking a balance between necessary caution and scientific progress is a complex challenge, one that continues to shape the future of MDMA-assisted therapy and other groundbreaking treatments. For advocates of MDMA therapy, the road to FDA approval will require well-designed research that proves the drug's safety and effectiveness. However, concerns about the slow pace of this process are valid, especially since delays could prolong the suffering of those with PTSD. Ultimately, the difficulty lies in maintaining strong safety standards while allowing promising treatments to reach those who need them most.